if we don't even have this sort of baseline understanding of what we have, how can we move forward? So this is what this project is about, just sort of very, very basic task of trying to fill in the information of how much open space different parts of Hong Kong have, who can enjoy it, and which demographic groups have the most and least access to open space. When I'm talking about open space, since the purpose of my research was to evaluate how effective the government is in fulfilling its own open space standards, I used the government's own definition of open space. It's probably impossible for you to read this from the back, but you have the things to the side. But here we have, in this red box is what the government counts as open space. This is countable open space. In the government's definition, open space must be managed for recreational purposes. So basically, there has to be a body responsible for managing it. It must be accessible to an identifiable resident or worker population. This is the standard they use. Note that this does not say the general public. Within countable open space, they divide this into something called local open space, which are small spaces mainly for passive recreation. For example, pocket parks, sitting out areas, and children's playgrounds within 400 meters of residents' homes. A second category they call district open space, which are medium to large parks, at least 1 hectare in area, for both passive and active recreation. Active recreation meaning like sports and exercise. This odd thing that they do here, regional open space, this is our largest urban parks in Hong Kong, Victoria Park, Kowloon Park, things like that. And for some reason, because it serves all of Hong Kong, they only count half of regional open space into district open space. The rest they regard as bonus, and it's therefore not counted towards the standard. It's confusing, and I'm not entirely sure why they do this, but that's the way it is. And so the official figure actually slightly understates the amount of open space we actually have. So our countable open space in 2012, which is the most recent figures I was able to obtain, 1,932.9 hectares. On the right are all the things the government does not count as open space, even though they do play important recreational purposes and roles. Country parks, green belts, conservation areas, agricultural land used or disused, members-only recreation clubs, and these unmanaged informal spaces that people might be using anyway, and of course our streets, pedestrian passageways, all this urban space that is not officially for recreation, but which people may sometimes use for recreation, does not get counted. So within the box of countable open space, we have different providers. It's not all provided by the government. The biggest provider is the Leisure Cultural Services Department, no surprise there. But the second largest is the Housing Authority. Now, all the gardens within public housing estates are counted as part of Hong Kong's open space. And it is also called public open space, since anyone can technically use it, even if they don't live there. At the bottom, this tiny pink square, that's probably about 2% of the total, is what we call public open space and private developments. In the last few years, we've heard a lot about these, the rooftop of IFC, Times Square, all these shopping mall spaces that are managed and provided by private developers for the public to use, and there have been disputes over whether they've been managed properly or whether they've been appropriated for commercial purposes, et cetera. We're actually arguing over 2% of our overall open space in this case. This larger orange chunk here, private open space, as in completely 100% private. No one except for residents can use it. These are basically the big podium gardens provided in large residential private developments. And these are only available for the use of residents and their guests, yet the government does count them towards the open space standard, the identifiable residential population. Overall in Hong Kong, the planning standards and guidelines say that we should have 2 square meters of open space per person. We actually achieved in 2012 2.7, and the government is proposing to raise its standard to 2.5. So, okay, so we've achieved our standard. Is everything fine? Can everyone go home now? No, not necessarily. This is why. So if you look at an international comparison, Hong Kong is actually pretty low compared to other Asian cities. I'm not even talking about London, New York, and Paris. I'm talking about Tokyo, 5.8, Seoul, 6.1, Singapore, 7.4, Shanghai, 7.6 square meters of open space per person. I put in Mumbai because, like us, they aspire to have 2 square meters of open space per person, but unlike us, they don't actually achieve it. So that is the only city I could find with a standard as low as ours that is intentionally set at that level. Again, I talked about how difficult it was to actually just find this information. So data transparency is an issue. We managed to obtain from the planning department open space figures for the district level, the 18 districts in Hong Kong. However, if you think about how large a district is, like Southern District stretches all the way from Pak Fu Lam down to like Stanley. Is that even a meaningful geographical area? Not necessarily in terms of if you're looking at how people are using it, space and traveling through their daily lives. So I thought this is not quite detailed enough. So how do we get more detailed information? So I basically spent 6 months reverse engineering open space figures from various different government sources. The Leisure Cultural Services Department has this statutory list of public pleasure grounds. There's like 1,700 of them. I counted those. The Lands Department, the Buildings Department has a list of all the public open spaces and private developments, that 2%. I counted those. And the other categories, the Housing Authority stuff and the private open space, they were very difficult to obtain. All I had were those figures provided by the planning department at the district level, and in order to actually try to estimate how much there is at a smaller geographical scale, I had to basically make assumptions about the amount of open space that planners allocate per flat in these large developments, and a sort of guess based on that. So put it all together, and this is the map that I came up with. You can take one of these maps home. They're over there. So I divided into the 57 urban outline zoning plans. Outline zoning plans are sort of roughly correlate to what we would call identifiable neighborhoods. For example, Mong Kok, Yau Ma Tei, Kowloon Tong, areas that sort of you would be able to identify in your mind. So there's a lot more of them than 18 districts. And brown areas are those with the least open space that are below the 2 meter square standard. And the dark green areas are the ones with the most open space. So you can see that the worst areas are basically concentrated on the north side of Hong Kong Island and in inner Kowloon. So the worst are Wan Chai, Mong Kok, the mid-levels. And then we have Kennedy Town, Pak Fu Lam, Sai Ying Pun, North Point, Quarry Bay, Shau Kei Wan, Yau Ma Tei here, Hung Hom, Ma Tau Gok, Ho Man Tin, and Cheung Sa Wan, which also covers Sham Shui Po. So in the new territories, you can generally see that it's better, and the south side of Hong Kong Island and Lantau are generally the best areas. These are the 10 worst ones in terms of open space per capita. I want to point out a few anomalies. So mid-levels west looks very green if you're there. Actually, this is mostly greenbelt land, so it's not usable for recreation or managed for recreation. That's why it comes out low, since it's hilly. And most of it is you can see it, but not go there. Kwun Tong North is a little weird of case because it's actually mostly under construction right now. So it's probably a little unfair to put it in there. There's like one public housing estate that's currently lived in, and the rest is a giant construction site in the Anderson Road Quarry area. Mid-levels east and Pak Fu Lam, again, similar to mid-levels west, hilly areas with a lot of greenbelt space, but not a lot of usable space. Mid-levels east does have the Bowen Road jogging trail, but they don't count that because it's linear and not an area, so it's a little odd. So it's a little bit of an undercount. And then we have Ma Wan and Yuen Long as the only new territories area that fall below the 2 meter square standard. In terms of population, how many people are actually living with less than the standard? Like how many people does this affect? So around 1.8 million people have less than 2 meters square per person. And then another 2 million have between 2 and 2.5. So that's the government's new proposed standard. So if the government were to raise its standard to 2.5 square meters per person, that would cover 3.9 million people in our population. But if, I propose that we move the standard up to 3 square meters per person, and that would cover 5.2 million people, which would be 3/4 of Hong Kong's urban population. So one of the major goals of my research was to look at inequalities in open space provision, and this does depend heavily on what kind of housing you live in. So according to the Hong Kong Planning Standards and Guidelines, public housing estates and large private residential developments are all supposed to have at least 1 square meter of local open space per person, meaning that they are supposed to be self-sufficient in open space. I mean local open space, the local portion. This is explicitly done in order to provide people with local open space right where they live. So if you live in public housing, overall through Hong Kong, so that's basically all the public housing residents, all the open space in public housing divided by all public housing residents, that works out to 2.1 square meters per person. So that's actually relatively generous. That's pretty generous. It's double the requirement. Large private developments, about 1.5, and I had to fudge these numbers a little because you can't actually find out which private developments have private open space or how much of it exactly. You kind of can only get it on the district level and kind of guess based on what large developments you have in that district, roughly where they are. But 1.5 square meters per person, and it's less generous than the public sector because obviously developers are worried about their gross floor area and profit margins, so they can't devote quite as much open space to their residents. But if you live in other private housing individual buildings, then you only get 1.3 square meters of open space. Now, what do I mean by 1.3? Well, these are like the public open spaces that basically is all you can use if you live in a building with no dedicated open space of its own. So 1.3 is actually an overestimate because it's not solely theirs. They need to share it with everybody else who happens to come by and want to use it. It's not solely theirs. It does vary a lot based on what part of Hong Kong you are living in. So if you're living on Hong Kong Island and you live in other private housing individual buildings, you're only getting 0.8 square meters per person. Kowloon, you get a little bit better, it's 1.1 compared to if you live in public housing or big private developments. New territories, actually, there's not much of a problem there. You get up to 1.5, which is even more than those in the large private developments. And in the islands, well, there's so many beaches that if you don't live in a large development, it's not a problem at all. You still get 4.4. That's a lot. So this raises the question of should this private open space that is not usable by anyone except the residents of that particular development, say Discovery Bay, should that still be countable as open space? I mean, most other cities wouldn't count private open space. They would regard it as something separate. But arguably, it plays an important role in Hong Kong, particularly in the new territories where developments are larger, they're further apart, and there is a valid reason for providing people with some open space right where they live. But as I showed earlier, in dense urban areas, it results in inequalities. You end up with sort of like these fortress developments where people from the outside can't come in, and there's limited community benefit overall for that neighborhood. So how can we make access to open space fairer? So these two examples. One is very typical podium residential garden in Wan Chai. If you're at the street level, you probably wouldn't even know it was there. You'd see a few bushes sticking up over the top of the building, and you can't use it. So if you happen to live next door to this development, you don't get to enjoy any of its benefits, really. Unless you live on a high floor, you probably won't even see it. A better way would be to put the open space at the ground level where the public can use it. And this is a development in Chunwan where there's a shopping mall around here. There's a courtyard in the middle, and this entrance goes out to the street. So this enables neighboring residents to use the open space. So how do we achieve this in policy terms? It's quite difficult because at sites with major retail potential, developers aren't going to be willing to give up the ground level in order to provide open space because that land is just too valuable. But where possible, and not all developments, even in major urban areas, necessarily have retail potential, reduce the podium footprint, put the car parking underground, or if it's near an MTR line, waive the parking requirement, so you don't even have to build a car park, and reduce the private portion of the open space and increase the public portion of the open space. When the government decides, basically the government will tell private developers how much open space they need to include in a large development, and usually they calculate it like this. They first, what is the expected population of the development, and then based on that they calculate how much open space per person there needs to be for the private residents. And then if there's any space left over and the district has a shortage of open space, then they figure out how much they can provide to the public. It's kind of a rigid way of doing this. So if you just sort of shift the line between the public and private, and you provide less private and more public, you're still providing the same amount of open space overall, but more of it's usable by the neighborhood. And I think that's a good thing. You don't have to be so rigid in adhering to the standard of the HKPSG. Other inequalities I looked at, income inequality. So this is an income map of Hong Kong. The red areas are lower income, the blue areas are higher income, the white areas are in the middle. So I'm going to zoom in to the central part of Hong Kong, and as you can see, the blue areas also seem to have the most open space per person because they're generally low density in addition to having more open space in general. So you see how Kowloon Tong sticks out right there, blue. And it's very green here. And then the south side of Hong Kong Island here pretty much aligns with the green area there. So that's those. However, the lowest income areas don't have the worst open space, and that is because of the housing that I pointed out earlier, that the public housing estates are actually very generous in terms of their open space provision. And this is why lower income areas tend to be, relatively okay in terms of their open space as long as these people are living in public housing. So the worst areas actually are these in the middle of Hong Kong, of Kowloon Peninsula and the north side of Hong Kong Island. And you can see that they're actually quite mixed in terms of income. Some of them have higher concentrations of poor people who are living in old Tong Lau, basically. But they're generally quite mixed income. In terms of age, I also looked at inequalities in open space access according to the proportion of the population that is elderly, like over the age of 65. So here's the map. The white areas, the paler areas are younger, darker blue is older. So if dark blue is over 18% of the population is over the age of 65, and it's only like below 9% for the white. So again, I'm going to zoom into the middle where you tend to find the oldest areas of Hong Kong. So what you see is like a lot of more elderly people here in the West Kowloon, East Kowloon, and North Hong Kong Island. Again, some of these are pretty bad in terms of open space, some of the worst areas of open space per capita. But the left and the right, they're actually better. These are basically the public housing belts built in the 60s and the 70s. And I suppose a lot of these residents moved in back then and they still haven't left. And they're still alive. So why did I focus on these two demographic groups? Well, according to overseas research on the relationship between public health and open space, actually the benefits of open space go disproportionately to those who are low income and the elderly. And that's because basically they are more dependent on the open spaces in their neighborhood for their recreational and social needs. If you're low income, then you have fewer recreational choices because you can't go and spend money on, travel or, gyms or those sorts of things. And retirees tend to spend a lot of time outdoors in open space where they chat with their friends and neighbors. So the health benefits accrue disproportionately to these groups. There's even one Japanese study that says that elderly people who live near green open space that is walkable, they live longer. So I identified the highest priorities areas for the government to improve open space based on both poverty and age. So here with 2 X's, it's Cheongsa-wan, Matakok, and Mongkok. So these are the highest priority areas to improve. So how exactly do we improve our supply of open space? We keep saying in Hong Kong that there's not enough land. Well, in fact, we have 1,116 hectares, roughly, of land that the government has zoned for open space on the outline zoning plan, but the open space has not yet been implemented, so it is not yet usable. So that is basically equivalent to 52% of our existing open space. It's a lot of space that is not being used, even though it's been designated for that purpose. So why does it take so long? So planning department, when it zones something for a particular land use, if you're from a planning background, you already know this, they can't enforce it right away. It basically is the intended future use, and it has to wait for the redevelopment to happen naturally. So in the meantime, it could be used for other purposes. You look at the map and you see ones that are car parks and bus depots and all sorts of things, and you have to wait until those uses are no longer needed. And then after such time, it basically depends on whether the LCSD is able to get the funding to develop that space into recreational open space, or if a developer purchases a plot nearby and the government does a deal with them where they develop that open space as part of the overall program of development, and then they hand it back over to the government to manage afterwards. So this could take many years between all of these stages. So where do we find the most of these undeveloped open space zones? So the dark blue areas are where the open space zones are pretty much already all used up. White is where up over 70% is still actually not recreational open space. It's still undeveloped. So you see most of these in like Sha Tin, where there's like a whole hillside that's been zoned as open space. Zhengguano, the landfill, they're waiting to decommission that before they can turn that into a park. Never mind this, because that's a statistical glitch due to the fact that it's beaches. Pak Fu Lam has quite a lot, hillside land. But even in the dense urban areas, you still see somewhere between 40 and 70% of the O-zone land that is not actually usable yet. So Yamate, Hung Hom, and Ho Man Tin have quite a lot of open space zones that are not yet usable open space. And I'm also going to point out that in the future we'll be developing the West Kowloon Cultural District, the Central District Extension in North Wan Chai waterfront area, and Kai Tak, and these are going to be future sources of major open space. And the challenge with that is to ensure good pedestrian connections with the inland areas. So hypothetically, I did a calculation. What if we actually took all of these undeveloped open zones and developed them tomorrow? What would happen? This is the percentage of the population living with this amount of open space. So below 2 square meters per person, if you developed all of the open space and then you had the planned population living there, the percentage would drop from 19.7 to 16.3, which is not that much of an improvement because these are basically the most challenging areas to work in. But in these moderate areas between 2 and 2.5 square meters per person, that percentage of the population would fall dramatically from 22% to just 9%. Like those people would see a dramatic improvement. Between 2.5 and 3.5 square meters per person, that would also fall from 37% to 26%. And the last category, the people with the most open space, over 3.5 square meters per person, that would double, more than double, from 20% currently to 47% of the population in the future. So what are the obstacles to ozone development? Well, we do have budget limitations. In order to get funding for a large project, you need to go through LegCo approval, and to go through LegCo approval, basically the highest levels of government need to deem this a big enough priority to think it's worth asking LegCo for this money. And open space has generally not been a very high priority in our city's development. For smaller projects, basically there's the Capital Works Reserve Fund, which is divided into these various pots. And every year, each government department has to submit applications for these small projects, and they have to go through an approval process, and different departments, different interests are weighed against each other, and the high priority ones are approved first. So basically, it could take years to get the funding just to build a new small park in a neighborhood. Again, another issue is private ownership. Some of this ozoned land is actually privately owned. It's been zoned for open space, but in order to actually turn it into open space, the government would have to basically resume it. They'd have to buy it back from the owner, and that would be very expensive. They'd have to pay market rate. Again, the temporary usage that I mentioned earlier. And again, finally, some of this land is actually not particularly suitable for recreation. A lot of it was zoned a long time ago before they had really good standards about what you should zone for open space and what you shouldn't. So you'll find some that is between highways or on very steep slopes or traffic islands and weird things like this under a highway in Yau Ma Tei. That is technically open space on a map, on a zoning map, but I'm not entirely sure how you could ever turn that into a usable park. Policy recommendations. So what are some of the potential solutions? First of all, we need to look at our bank of ozoned land and see which ones are actually feasible to turn into open space quickly. So I think the government needs to do a review to see which parts can be fast-tracked to development. And we need enough money. The government should allocate, say, $2 billion, it's just a number off the top of my head, to fund smaller scale open space projects where the district councils can help identify sites and to identify existing open spaces that need upgrades. I mean, we've done similar things before for like building rehabilitation, the Building Bright operation several years ago, and there's one for building lifts and staircase and disabled access and footbridges and stuff. So we could do something similar and make open space an issue. All right. And stop rezoning ozones for housing, because we are currently making the problem worse by taking ozones and turning them into residential zones. Update the planning standards and guidelines. Raise it from 2 to 3. Introduce an evidence-based catchment radius for district open space. So I mentioned earlier that local open space has a 400-meter radius catchment. In theory, there isn't one for district open space. So you could, sometimes you see this on a map, there's a district boundary, and you'll have all the open spaces clumped on either side of it because that just happened to be where there was a bunch of empty land, and that doesn't really take into account how far people need to travel. Set a standard for the regional open space. Since we only currently count half of it, the rest of it is treated like it doesn't really matter. So large parks are particularly vulnerable to being taken over for other uses like infrastructure projects or like fairs or commercial events and things like that. So it needs to be given a value in the planning process. Again, the data transparency. So basically, these figures that I obtained from the planning department, they've only actually been released to the public once ever in 2008 in response to a LegCo inquiry over these controversial public open spaces and private developments. They don't normally release these figures, and they should. And basically, the community has a right to know these figures in order to actually advocate for and to create a better living environment. So I propose the government should release figures at the outline zoning plan level, the small level that I very painstakingly put together, every 5 years coinciding with the census and bi-census. In general, so yes, our new waterfront parks need to be world-class and they need to have excellent pedestrian connections. In the long term, we have to review our urban renewal policies because right now we have this self-funding model where you need to demolish small buildings and build larger buildings in order for that to make a profit, and there's very limited scope to put more open space into the dense urban areas if your process looks like that. And maybe we should explore more creative strategies to open up new spaces in urban areas, like street closures and cooperation with schools, universities, to open up their grounds to public use. And another thing the government is actually doing right now is urban waterways restoration. So the Kaitak stream is being restored, and that will be usable in a few years' time. But of course, I've been only talking about quantity in my talk. That's what my research focuses on, and quality matters just as much. If you have such limited space, then you need to have good quality. And I show these photos to illustrate a couple of things. This is what our small sitting out areas often look like, which are pretty grim. And here are some photos from around the world. I mean, sometimes like just a little bit of imaginative street furniture can help. That's from Berlin. This actually was where I went to university in Boston. And this is a tiny little, it's almost like a traffic circle. But I mean, all you need is some trees and some picnic tables, and it's a successful open space. It's not expensive to do. It's very simple, and yet it's effective. New York City is done something even cheaper. Like they've been closing off roads or road space that is excessive, and they just paint the ground, and they put out some lawn furniture. It's cheap as anything, and it can be successful already.